Okay, so without more ado, let me welcome Professor Jim Secord, who I know is known to many of us here in Cambridge, Professor of History and Philosophy of Science in the History and Philosophy of Science Department, also Director of the wonderful Darwin Correspondence Project, which has entirely transformed Darwin studies for people working in that area, and also done such a lot to help people get insight into Darwin himself, Darwin the man, if you like. Written lots of books. Two of Jim's books are on the piano, unfortunately not for sale, but do browse those as well afterwards. And today he's going to speak to us on the secret history of Victorian evolution. Thanks, Jim, very much.
Right, well, thank you very much, and thanks particularly for the invitation to speak here today. I really have a confession to make to begin with, and that is that I am director of the Darwin Correspondence Project. I've spent most of the last year, certainly, and most of the rest of this year I'll be spending making Darwin better known. It's part of my job as director of the Darwin Correspondence. But among my colleagues, this has put me in rather an odd situation, because in fact, my main reputation has been built on showing that effectively Darwin was less important than we actually showed. And one of the books in the piano, Victorian Sensation, is very much about some of the events that I'm going to be talking today. However, I have to say I really welcome the opportunity that it was provided when they said, we want you to talk about some historical topic relating to 19th century evolution, and you don't really have to talk primarily about Darwin. So that's how I came up with the title that I'm talking on today, The Secret History of Victorian Evolution. What I want to do today is to take us, in some ways, behind the scenes of Victorian evolution, to look at, in some ways, what was really going on, and particularly to put us in the position of people who tackled the origin of species when it came out on the day it was published. What I want to do first, though, is to point to a problematic image that I think we're all familiar with right now. This is the symbol that was chosen by the Natural History Museum for the national celebrations of Darwin 200. And it symbolizes, I think, everything that's problematic. And this includes both my Darwinian self and my non-Darwinian self. I think this image is problematic. And in particular, I think the difficulty with it, of course, is that Darwin here is effectively black boxed. And you don't really know what he's about. It's the image of the old Darwin with his beard. But I think the most telling thing about it is, of course, the lightning bolt that's coming down through his head. Now this, I think, would make an incredible advertisement for Advil in Darwin 200 years. But I don't think it makes a particularly good advertisement for how we think we need to think about Darwin. Because Darwin was not an individual genius, first of all. He was not black boxed. We know a remarkable amount about what went on inside that head. And one thing we know for sure is that there wasn't a sudden lightning bolt of inspiration that led one man to come up with the theory that we have today. So what I want to do is to help you to think, and to think together with you about some other ways about thinking about Darwin and his most important book on the origin of species. And to do this, I think what we need to do, and this is really the central point of my talk, is not to focus on an individual person like Darwin, and not to even focus on other founders of evolution as individual thinkers or people. I think we need to focus, first of all, on readers. What happened when you opened up this book, The Origin of Species, and began to read? What kind of things? The hundreds of thousands of people, the millions of people now that have read The Origin of Species, those are the people that have actually made the real difference. And of course, in November 1859, they were not just readers of The Origin of Species. They had read all sorts of other things. They were dealing with a subject that had a history. So I want to take you through a little bit about the reading history of evolution before Darwin and give you some idea of what that was like. To really understand this, I think we need to go back into the 18th century to the age of the Enlightenment. And here you have two figures who are very well known within this story. The man on the left is Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, in fact, who wrote a very well-known poem called Botanic Garden, wrote other works on zoological philosophy. In the late 18th century, these were incredibly popular works in England, sold very well, so that if you look up in the Times newspaper in the 1820s and 30s, what does Darwinize mean? It means to think like Erasmus Darwin, and particular to believe that there's some sort of chain of being that gradually comes up through spontaneous generation. Figure on the right is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, one of the great generation of French naturalists just before and around the time of the French Revolution. Lamarck again wrote books that actually discussed a progressive history of evolution and related it to much broader kinds of circumstances. So it was part of an Enlightenment story of general progress, very widely discussed and debated in France, not so widely debated, in fact, in England. And there is, in fact, was, I think, quite a good reason for this. Partly, I think we need to look at the kind of theories that both Erasmus Darwin and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came up with. They were effectively theories of spontaneous generation of monads. You can see over time, new organisms are continually coming into being, and you have the scale of being observed as we have it today, say with humans up at the top, and say slime molds or something like that down at the bottom, and the ones that are down at the bottom are just those that haven't evolved the most. For Lamarck, what happens to old species? Well, they don't die away. There's no extinction. They just evolve into the next species higher up the line. So it's like an escalator view of the way in which evolution works. Now, I stress this kind of point of view because basically, around the time of the late Enlightenment, these theories were not kind of super shocking or horrible. They were actually quite widely discussed and debated among polite society. They were the kind of things that you talk about at a dinner party or a soiree. The books are published in nice editions, especially Erasmus Darwin's. They're effectively subjects for popular conversation among the elite. This changes really dramatically around the decades around 1800. And the reason for that is quite simple, the series of revolutions in France. This is from the 1830 revolution in Paris, but you can see the sort of thing that people were afraid of. Effectively, as Edmund Burke put it, there was hot air let loose in Europe. There was this revolutionary volcano that had come about, and this transformed not only political life, but it of course transformed religious life and intellectual life. And I think we need to understand the depths of fears of this that went right through the 19th century to understand the curious history of why leaders who had during the Enlightenment been quite positive about ideas of evolution and who liked Erasmus Darwin now find these ideas dangerous and shocking. Take this picture, Death or Liberty, Britannia, or the virtues of the Constitution in danger. Well, what we can see here, this is a great picture, and I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but what you can see here is the Britannia, the Virgin, with radical reform, having a cloak over it, this cloak, and underneath it is basically this skeleton skull. And underneath also all of this, you can see the dangerous things that are here, including Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. There isn't a copy of Lamarck under there, or Erasmus Darwin, but there well could be. These are exactly the kind of works which the evolutionary works became associated with. So suddenly they became dangerous materialism, something that wasn't just fun to talk about at a party, but was absolutely, really quite terrifying. And you can see here, Britannia is actually on the rock of religion, of course, and the lion is coming to the rescue with the laws up here to save it. Whereas on the other hand, you have the cap of liberty and death coming over to attack it. Now this image, of course, is very highly stated, and it comes right from the peak of the anti-revolutionary paranoia. But this is a kind of attitude that persisted right through the middle of the 19th century in Britain. So to understand the fate of the kinds of ideas that evolution could be associated with, we need to understand the depth of that kind of reaction. I think one of the things to stress about this then, that it made thinking, talking about, working with subjects like the development of one species out of another, something that was curiously difficult to do throughout the 30s and early 40s. It's why, for example, the young Charles Darwin wrote to his budding friend, Joseph Hooker, the botanist, that saying that he was working on transmutation was like confessing a murder. He was afraid, partly because it was something that was effectively now outside science. But he was also, of course, afraid because it was something that would be seen as irreligious and potentially dangerous. So he marks his most private thoughts about these kind of subjects. He keeps them in special notebooks, and he writes on the front of them, private. These are materials for himself. They aren't the kind of subjects you can talk about in public in the kind of way that had been the case earlier in the century, particularly in the 18th century. Now, what's interesting then is to see how this story begins to change. And I think our traditional picture of how it changes is pretty much associated with that image with which I began. the image of Charles Darwin with the lightning bolt coming down in his back, the image of the first page of The Origin of Species. Darwin is the person who revives the theories of Lamarck and others, puts a new twist on them with this important innovation of natural selection, makes effectively these ideas safe for science, and brings them in some sense into the core of the 19th century. Now there are some elements of truth to that story, but I'm afraid there's not many. And what we have to do to understand it is, I think, to take off the kind of excrescences, and there's more and more of them coming on every day as we speak because of the 2009 celebrations. We need to get back to think about what actually happened in the 19th century. And to understand this, we need especially to look at this book, which I bet most of you have not heard of. This is The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Now, there are many interesting features to notice about this book. Probably the most interesting one is why I titled my talk Secret History of Evolution. Because, of course, just in that place where you'd expect there to be an author, on the title page, think back to Darwin, with all the, fellow of the Linnaean Society, fellow of the Geological Society, fellow of the Royal Society. Here, this is by a nobody, effectively, literally. It's interesting, it's published by a medical publisher, John Churchill, who was in fact a very reputable, well-known medical publisher, and it's published in 1844. So this is 15 years before The Origin of Species. Now, I think what's really interesting to note about this book is just how important it was to people in the mid-19th century. I've spent a lot of time studying it, and you might expect me to say that it was that important. But in fact, I think if you had asked any Victorian in 1859, what's the big book on evolution, they would have said, The Vestiges. That's the real book. And that, in fact, Darwin effectively says that as well. It's the one book in The Origin of Species that he assumes all his readers have actually read. So it has a kind of foundational quality to the whole experience of how evolution was actually tackled in the 19th century that I think we need to take into account. Now, what does this rather curious anonymous book with this rather strange title say? Well, effectively what it does is it takes a whole set of indications of progress in the natural world and combine them together. It starts off with, well, one of the kinds of progress that it has in it, certainly that's very important, is geological progress. You can see, as geologists have uncovered, this series of lost worlds during the 19th century. Here you can see ancient Dorset as depicted in 1830, with the various animals all attacking one another. But this is very much a picture of a world that had just been revealed, and it was shown to be part of a succession of new worlds revealed by geology during this period. Another way, and this is in fact what the book started with, that progress was revealed was in the heavens itself. Here you can see the great spiral nebulae that the great Ross telescope had observed in Ireland, and as its main advocate said, John Pringle Nichol, the spangling material universe is, as we see it, nothing other than one phase of a mighty progress. And then finally, there was evolution of the human mind itself. And we can see that here with this picture. It shows in sequence the different forms going back to invertebrates, right up through the higher invertebrates, and finally to orangutans and human beings. Now, all of these pictures did not necessarily add up to universal progress from the nebulae down to the origins of the human mind. In fact, the author of this particular picture, in its original version, actually said that each one of these stages was quite separate. They had no connection with one another in causal terms. They weren't, in other words, materially related through any kind of Lamarckian or Darwinian process of evolution. But you can see each one of these progresses. The idea was you put them all together. You start off with a blazing fire mist, then gradually this condenses, then you get the formation of the Earth, then you get the formation of the strata, then you get the formation of each one of the higher groups coming into being, and then finally you get men, and then finally, at the end, you get the successors to humans, potentially some form of angels, in fact. So there's a universal progress going on, an underlying development, which, as the anonymous author says, is as easy to understand as understanding how a woman comes to full term in pregnancy. So the world effectively is undergoing a universal gestation of nature. Now this kind of developmental cosmology, which is put forward in in Vestiges was potentially something that was dangerous to religion. So the anonymous author was very clear to make sure that this process had a divine direction. God worked through law was the Vestiges message, and it had a whole chapter about this. It argued that effectively, once we understand this developmental law is coming about through the kind of superintending will of God, we can see this developmental process is something which is at once material and at once divine. So there's no separation between these things. And as indeed Darwin later did, the author points out that, to have the idea that God sits there and figures out how to make a mollusk with a tiny little bit that's different doesn't make sense. It's much more grand for there to be the idea that each one of these new developments comes about through this developmental process of law. So that's what was in Vestiges. Now, there are many ways we could think about a book like this. One is to see it bringing together these new sciences, combining them, putting them before the Victorian public. We can see it very much as an intervention in this long-running, difficult debate about the relationship of science to reason and the French Revolution. What's happening with that? We could see it as the outcome of another individual author. This is Robert Chambers. Chambers was one of the co-founders of the Chambers Publishing Company. If you play Scrabble, you use the Chambers Dictionary as the official Scrabble dictionary. Chambers was a very active person within the useful knowledge movement of the early 19th century. And he was somebody who was very well known for his breadth of knowledge and his interest in a wide range of subjects. He wasn't, however, known as a man of science, and he was also anxious to protect his family and his business's reputation. So he kept himself very much to himself. Vestiges remained, as I said, very much anonymous work. So I think approaching it in terms of authors doesn't really make sense. We can see very much that the question of who the author was became a real talking point. Here's a cartoon from Punch a couple of years after the book came out, and you can see the Vestiges now. He's actually sitting at a foundling hospital with a little sign on its cap saying, "Wants a father." And underneath a whole range of different potential authors are actually suggested. These ranged across the board, usually people who have engaged in some ways in thinking about broader questions of species and origins. Charles Darwin, in fact, was one of the people who was occasionally suggested as an author for this work. But many people felt that the work had trouble. It wasn't quite scientific enough. There were facts in it that weren't quite right. It had taken a lot of revisions to get it up to speed. So, they weren't sure who it actually was. What I think that, in terms of how to approach a book like this, I think in the end what all of this shows is that approaching it to the author just is the wrong way to go. And in fact, as I said at the beginning, what we need to think first of all and foremost about is readers. And if we recast the history of evolution in the 19th century around readers, we can suddenly see the difference that a book like Vestiges actually made. Because Vestiges effectively was a sensation. It was, in modern parlance, a bestseller, a term which doesn't quite apply to this period, but it certainly sold very, very well. More than that, it was reviewed. It was reviewed in over 100 journals in Britain, reprinted very widely in the United States. It was discussed at dinner parties. It was, I think, very interesting, the sort of book that you could discuss in polite company. This was the first time, in other words, that that forbidden subject for nearly 50 years had come out of the closet and now is being discussed in a much more popular realm. There's a very interesting discussion I found about it from the 1830s where there's a point at which a group of geologists are in mixed company and they say, someone recollects afterwards, well, we had to wait to discuss Lamarck until after the ladies had left. So they had to, then over cigars they could talk about Lamarck. Vestiges is the sort of thing that you could talk about when the ladies were actually there. And that, I think, is a really important difference. It's a much broader kind of debate that can happen, and really is something that's central to Victorians in the 1840s. So it's one of the big sensations. And when I use the word sensation, I mean it in both senses of the word. It was, in the one sense, something that a lot of people heard about and were really excited about all at once. But it also was a sensation in terms of the immediate impact, almost the physiological impact it had on readers. Readers took hold of the book and some were horrified by it, some loved it, some found in it the basis for a new creed, but hardly anybody was neutral about it. It read, unlike many other books of this period, it reads effectively like a novel. It has a story. It starts off with this fire mist and ends with the higher destiny of human beings. So there's a great narrative push in the book, and readers felt like they just couldn't put it down. And we can see this if we look at a number of contemporary readers. One of the best-known readers for it, in fact, was from here at Cambridge, and that was Adam Sedgwick. Here you can see him in his geology museum in the old schools, as it was at the time in the 1840s. And Sedgwick wrote anonymously about the book in the Quarterly Edinburgh Review, and he was absolutely furious about what he found there. In particular, he was worried that both a woman had written it and that it was actually going to undermine the kind of way in which women in society generally, really the whole foundations of the support for the social order. It is our maxim, Sedgwick says, that things must be kept in their proper places if they are worked together for any good. If our glorious maidens and matrons may not soil their fingers with the dirty knife of the anatomist, neither may they poison the springs of joyous thought and modest feeling by listening to the seductions of this author, who comes before them with a bright, polished, and many-colored surface and the serpent coils of a false philosophy, and asks them again to stretch out their hands and pluck forbidden fruit, to talk familiarly with him of things which cannot be so much as named without raising a blush upon a modest cheek, that they are made in the language of God, that they are as children of apes and breeders of monsters. That their Bible is a fable when it teaches them that they are made in the image of God, that they are the children of apes and the breeders of monsters, that he has annulled all distinction between physical and moral, that the phenomena of the universe, dead and living, are to be put before the mind in a new jargon and as a progressive and development of a rank, unbending, and degrading materialism. So the talk about God, the talk about God's laws, from this point of view was, as he said, like the coating around a poisonous pill. It looked like it was the medicine you needed, but in fact, it was going to kill you. It was going to destroy society. And one of the most frequent complaints, which in fact Sedgwick talked about privately, but not in his letters, was that in fact the book was effectively a prostitute. That it had the pretty clothes, the nice dress of a woman you think would be wonderful to know, but in fact it was someone who was actually foul and corrupt. Just listen to one of the leading evangelical writers of this period, what they said about this book. We readily attribute to it all the graces of the accomplished harlot. Her song is like the siren for its melody and attractive sweetness. She is clothed in scarlet. And here you can see a copy of the book. And every kind of fancy work of dress and ornament. Her step is grace and lightness and life. Her laughter light, her very motion musical. But she is a foul and filthy thing, whose touch is taint, whose breath is contamination, whose look and words and thoughts will turn the spring of purity to a pest, of truth to lies, of life to death, of love to loathing. Such is philosophy without the maiden gem of truth and singleness of purpose, divorced from the sacred and ennobling rule and discipline of faith. So you can see this book was genuinely hated, despite the fact that the author really tried to present it, if not exactly in an Orthodox Christian way, certainly in a way which was very much compatible with the idea of the existence of God. And this was something that, was very difficult, in fact, for the author privately to understand. Robert Chambers couldn't really ever figure out why his book had had such a terrible reception. But I think what's interesting for us, really, like I said already, is the way in which there was such a wide response of reviewers. I've quoted some of the negative ones so far, but in fact, I think what's important to stress is that the bulk of the reaction was, in fact, surprisingly positive. The reviews, especially the early reviews, and especially the reviews among the general public, were very much that this looks like a cosmology that really has legs. This is really going to go somewhere. This is the kind of point of view that we really want to deal with. We're tired of all these individual isolated facts. We want science to tell us something about the larger story of life and the way that it works. And we can see that potentially this is actually something that's going to be compatible with religion. Maybe not exactly in the way that the author has told us, but in some sort of form. And we can see this in many, many of the responses. And one of the things I've tried to do when I was working on this subject was try and see how this kind of response spread among a whole range of really effectively ordinary people throughout Britain. I don't have time to do too many examples, but one I think is particularly telling, and that was a nonconformist woman school teacher who was more or less tutoring a group of children up in Carlisle, in Cumberland. And basically, she recalled obtaining the book when she was actually doing this teaching work. And she in fact got the book from her employer. She borrowed it illicitly because he just left it on the table overnight. And she was able, in fact, in her case, to run up to her little garret room and read it. And it was only when the dawn was finally coming that she could hear the birds that she had to put it down and finally had reached the last page. Now, what did a young woman like this think? Somebody who was very devout, who wrote a lot of religious poetry, was trying to teach young children, who was also very worried about questions of materialism and the role of God in the world. Here's what she says about it. She said initially she was intensely anxious to read the book, as it was that which had most excited the wonder and curiosity of the reading world. And it was also remembered as the most sensational book of its day. Calvinism, she said, was a sober truth with millions up until then. There were many of all denominations who lived daily in fear of hell, and skepticism of the archfiend's personal power was then considered equal in its wickedness to the doubt of a deity in a future state. Judge then the alarm and head-shaking this book was received with in the religious world. Many of them read it clandestinely, and then silently waited for the comments and criticisms of the press and pulpit. And what she actually found when she read it was that for her the book summed up the possibility of linking religion and science in a new kind of way. That there was going to be some sort of way in which a view of the origins of man coming about from natural causes could be combined with her own evangelical faith. And she brought these two together in the way that she thought about the book, and she actually wrote about it in a number of poems that she wrote. So she was very much concerned about its implications. It wasn't something that was easy to take on, but it was something that she thought could move the world forward. And she certainly had no time for the kind of comments that Sedgwick or Bosanquet actually put forward. And this, I think, was true of many people at the time. A lot of people felt that the book had scientific flaws, that because the author wasn't a working scientist, that there were some mistakes in the book. There were aspects of it that seemed amateurish. For example, it claimed that little mites came out of electrical experiments through spontaneous generation. In fact, that kind of experiment had quite a lot of justification within some of the contemporary scientific literature. But at some level also, it wasn't quite standard science, and it was potentially, for many people, a rather weak foundation to build a theory of evolution upon. Even if people questioned these particular facts, they thought, however, that the underlying idea of evolutionary cosmology, the idea of bringing the sciences together and understanding them in this kind of developmental way, that idea needed to be taken much more seriously. And in the end, I think what Vestiges really did in terms of this contemporary debate was not necessarily convince people that evolution was true, but they convinced people that it was something that you could talk about again. So this is the period from the mid-1840s, as a result of the Vestiges debate, quite directly, that the subject of evolution entered again onto the public stage. It becomes something that you can talk about, discuss, debate. And this is particularly true from the early 1850s onwards, because this is precisely, of course, the time in which Britain's political and religious controversies are beginning to ebb. This is the period after the Hungry 40s. It's the period of the Great Exhibition. Now Britain is looking forward to becoming a great trading and imperial power. And in some level, this kind of worries about the status of humans and so forth can be considered in a calmer and, in some sense, a more rational light. Now, what about Darwin's reaction to this? Well, of course, this is Darwin in the 1830s, around the time he was married, had been doing this secret theorizing that I talked about. His theory was quite different than Vestiges. Unlike Vestiges, which has this developmental model of kind of almost necessary progress through development, his model is much more one of random branching. And as the famous diagram on the right from his notebook shows. What did Darwin learn from reading Vestiges? Well, in scientific terms, I think it's fair to say that he didn't actually learn anything that he didn't know. Most of what was in Vestiges was, in some sense, bringing a lot of different ideas together in a comprehensible and understandable way. But Darwin did learn a number of incredibly important things in other ways. And that is, in particular, he learned about what an evolutionary debate was going to look like. Here he was writing about, I am a materialist, here's my theory of evolution. These are all things he's writing about in his notebooks. He's very worried about them. And now suddenly evolution is out in the open. And in fact, it was particularly telling for Darwin because just a few months before Vestiges had appeared, he had actually finished a book-length first draft of his evolutionary theory, which he had in his back pocket as Vestiges was actually being debated and discussed at British Association and other scientific meetings. So, Darwin had a lot to learn about what was going to happen. And I think what surprised him most was in some ways just how feeble and limited the criticisms were. He took Sedgwick's famous review in the Edinburgh Review, the one that talked about, the cutting your fingers on the knife of anatomy. He read that review and it had lots and lots of objections, over 80 pages of them. But Darwin felt that he had already met most of those. And more than that, what he learned was that people in Britain were willing to discuss and debate evolutionary ideas, as long as they would have a secure scientific foundation. And so Darwin, in some sense, had less to worry about than he thought. He watched the debate incredibly thoroughly. He learns a lot about how to conduct his own science. And it's very interesting, the thing he does in particular after this is that he really pushes into a huge study of zoological classification. He starts working on barnacles at this point. And clearly, I think one of the reasons for this is he wants to establish his credentials as somebody who's not just another amateur, anonymous cosmologist. He wants to be a man of science. And not just in geology, where he was already very well known, but in many different fields of science, and in particular in the area that was most relevant and important for his work, which was zoology. So he begins this kind of big projects, publishes, in fact, 4 books on the taxonomy of barnacles, both fossil and recent. So these are major works of science. So Darwin learned a lot from the Vestiges controversy about how not to conduct a debate, and he also gained a huge amount just because, in some sense, there had been such a gigantic debate already. The field was now open. People, I'd say your typical person in Britain who opened up the origin of species was ready to believe that evolution might be the case. They were just waiting for men of science to put their stamp of approval on it. And that's effectively what Darwin actually does. When The Origin of Species comes out, it's very much, in some ways, you can see this title page almost as a reply to the title page of Vestiges. If we look, for example, at the way now, of course, we do have an author on the title page who is a fellow of all these societies. He's also the author of a popular travel book, the Journal of Researches, so people know that he can write as well. And of course, as many of you will know, he very importantly makes sure to frame his work within a broadly theological religious context. He has a quotation from William Whewell, the master of Trinity College, his Bridgewater treatise on the role of God in the world, and in this case, in particular in relationship to astronomy, and you can see that it talks specifically, Whewell's comment is basically, with regard to the material world, we can at least go as far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. Well, does that sound familiar? Of course. That's exactly the argument that Vestiges was using. In Whewell's mouth, of course, it sounds much more convincing to a general public audience, but it's the same argument that Vestiges was based on. General laws are the way we need to understand God's relationship through the world, not through specific acts of creation. And similarly here, we have a quote from Francis Bacon in The Advancement of Learning, and saying that we need to be able to, effectively this is a quotation that argues for the openness of inquiry. We need to be able to search forward and to understand nature, to conclude, therefore, let no man, out of a weak conceit of sobriety or an ill-applied moderation, think or maintain that a man can search too far are to be well studied in the book of God's words, or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, which I think would be a good model for just about anybody. So you can see very much this idea of openness of inquiry and understanding these laws is the frame that Darwin himself actually uses. And if you look, of course, at the book itself, particularly from the second edition onwards, Darwin actually includes the word creator in the very last sentence of The Origin of Species. So Darwin is very much concerned to frame his work in this same sort of context. Now it's interesting, Darwin in fact talks less about God, quite a lot less, than Vestiges does. Now I don't think this is because Darwin doesn't think it's an important issue, it's just a tactical move. In many ways I think he doesn't want his book to be seen as a piece of theological philosophy. He wants it to be seen effectively as an intervention in a scientific debate. So the materials that are specifically around creation tend to be more in the margins of Darwin's works. They're part of the paratext, effectively, not the main text. But readers knew what they were getting. They were getting this kind of intervention in this long-going debate that Vestiges, in many ways, had actually transformed. So I think that what you can see then is that, in some ways, the reading of The Origin was entirely going to be shaped by the way in which his whole audience had actually been reading Vestiges. I mean, just imagine if you had all just been reading Vestiges, talking about it for 15 years, it was still in the press and being discussed, and then suddenly I came in and I say, I'm Charles Darwin, I'm a man of science, and I have a theory of evolution. Well, you would all immediately start to think, well, yeah, of course, we know about that, and you'd immediately frame it in ways that were based on your previous expectations about the book you had been reading and the discussion you had been having. And you can see this over and over again in the reception of The Origin of Species. Partly in this theological realm that I've been talking about, partly also, and this I think is absolutely fascinating, is in relationship to the relationship of The Origin of Species to an understanding of the origins of humans. Now, it's famously known that there's a few odd references to humans in The Origin of Species. There's only one sentence. Light will be shown on the throne on the origins of man and his history in the entire book that deals with man. One sentence. But readers knew how to read the book. They actually read it in this framed context where the idea of progress from the original origins of the universe up till man was very much the subject of what books like this were about. So Darwin, in some sense, is seen as fitting a particular sort of piece into the puzzle. He's actually intervening in the debate in a way that means that it can be solved in a different kind of way. Probably the person who recognized this most was Thomas Henry Huxley. Now Huxley is interesting for many respects in this discussion. Huxley absolutely hated Vestiges. He actually agreed that Sedgwick had a better approach to the subject of evolution, which is quite striking actually, given that Sedgwick was a cleric and actually in many ways, for many, many of Huxley's friends and people he moved around, Sedgwick was seen to be basically, really past his prime, an old man who really didn't know what was going on anymore. And Huxley was very much part of a young, upcoming generation trying to free science from what they saw as theological shackles. So you've got Huxley, this kind of up-and-coming person, praising Sedgwick for his attack on Vestiges. Why does he attack it? Well, basically, Huxley thinks that he's arguing for these rightful natural causes, but he's doing it in a way which isn't scientific enough. And what Huxley's really looking for is a way to make it so that science can address the really large questions that human beings have to face. And so it's not surprising when Huxley finally reads The Origin of Species that he says, how stupid not to have thought of that. He's absolutely gobsmacked. Here you have a way of approaching this whole subject of creation, and not just the creation of new species from varieties, and this very specific question addressed in Origins. Huxley knows that the game has been set by this broad post-Enlightenment debate now about the way in which you get creation by law. And now science is going to be able to answer that question because Darwin has tackled that particular piece of the puzzle, that crucial kind of keystone of the argument. The really funny thing about it is when he reads about natural selection, and he says, how stupid not to have thought of that, is that Huxley doesn't think that natural selection is the right explanation for the origin of species. he thinks that it hasn't been proved experimentally. And until it is, you can't be sure that it's going to be right. And it probably isn't going to be the right answer. But what he does think, Huxley thinks, this is great. At least we now have a scientific sort of explanation to discuss and debate. And it's that that really matters for him. So tackling it in this way, with an explanation that might not be the right one, but at least for him has a scientific grounding behind it, is a way of transforming the debate. So what we can see the origin of species becoming is effectively a kind of flag for the new party that Huxley and his friends represent. A way of making science so that it can actually lead the new kind of imperial Britain that was developing, the new kind of Britain that was based on free trade, one that was much more politically liberal, and having an evolutionary cosmology within that. And Huxley sees this very, very strongly. And it's why in the year after The Origin of Species, he's the first person to coin the word Darwinism, which he calls a Whitworth gun in the armory of liberalism. Now, one of the things we can see is, of course, the effect that this has on Darwin himself. And I think one thing that it does, and the reason I'm showing you this picture, is it effectively turns Darwin into an icon. When we have a picture like this, when we think about The Origin of Species today, we tend, of course, to forget about the whole history of evolution that goes before Darwin, not just Robert Chambers. I mean, that would be ridiculous to kind of base an entire view of what happened before the story based on just one person. And in fact, I might mention also, the same thing is also true with Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace is a fascinating person, a great traveler, wonderful scientist, did really important work on biogeography, and also was the co-discoverer of the principle of natural selection. But I think we make a mistake if we say the way to get a more balanced view is to spend more time studying Wallace or more time studying Chambers or something like that. We need to take a broader view of what intellectual discussion and debate is about. And what we need to see is the role of these books in changing the way that reading audiences actually approach topics, and particularly the way in which this very controversial and difficult subject was actually tackled during the 19th century, and how a book like Vestiges could actually transform the terms of the debate. So when The Origin of Species come, effectively, the debate is much less tough, much less difficult than anybody, I think, really realizes today. It's not a huge drawn battle between science and the church at that point. The kinds of criticisms I read from Sedgwick and Bosanquet, there's a few of those against The Origin, but nothing like the outrage that had greeted a lot of what Vestiges had in it. As Darwin himself said, in some sense, Vestiges has served as a lightning rod to draw down the criticism and to make a different sort of world. And in fact, that different sort of world, it wasn't just the product of that one book or that one reading experience. It was the whole product of the way that intellectual life in Britain had changed during this period. We today celebrate Darwin in 2009, obviously for reasons that have as much to do with why we're thinking about science now and its particular relationships with religion and its particular role within science and how evolution works within that. Those are central questions for us, and that's why we're thinking about Darwin specifically. But I think if we're thinking about the history of evolution and why generally we view things the way we do, we need to take a much broader kind of conspectus. And we need to realize that, in fact, it's Darwin's very success that means that behind this picture, behind that veil, is actually the not just Robert Chambers, but a whole history of reading and understanding. Take this chart, which just briefly shows the total number of copies of Vestiges versus The Origin of Species in existence during the course of the 19th century. We have the first edition of the Vestiges here in October 1845, and you'll see, of course, it has this huge number of copies published, up to basically this is 25,000 copies. That's a lot for a book of that kind. Around the time The Origin of Species comes into existence. And of course, The Origin only has 1,250 copies. It takes a long time to catch up, but you can see actually it's really only consistently outsold in terms of total number of copies by the 1890s. So there's a kind of way in which our view is obviously skewed here. And in fact, if you added all the kind of non-Darwinian, progress-oriented, kind of fire mist to humans kind of books that are around, they would totally dwarf The Origin of Species. So I think we need to keep this kind of view in mind. Somewhere between this sort of statistic and the picture of the individual woman reader I showed you is the truth about the way these books were actually tackled. But I think to really understand what's going on, we need to understand that the terms of the debate, the kinds of questions we're also debating now, are not ones that Darwin was the person who founded them. We need to think that those kinds of questions were issues which were actually founded in the course of the 19th century, in particular, well before the origin of species. Take this wonderful painting that this summer, on mid-June, the Fitzwilliam Museum is going to be having a wonderful exhibition about Darwin and the visual arts. And this is one of the paintings that you can see in the exhibition. It's by William Dyce, who's a very important religious painter, and it shows effectively a group of women here who are collecting various objects, probably seaweeds, maybe fossil shells, along the coasts of Kent. And it's a recollection of a particular day, October 5th, 1858. It's notable, of course, for Donati's comet, which was visible in the sky that night. But of course, it's very telling and almost tragic that no one is paying attention to this spectacular, fantastic comet, which sort of gives some idea of the cosmic insignificance of humans. Have their faces down on these rocks, almost pushed down by the sheer force of these cliffs. So there's a sense of oppression and sadness, and you can almost feel those kind of waves coming in that Arnold talks about in Dover Beach. Now, this painting is often seen as a kind of culmination of the debate and the discussion about the origin of species. But of course, it's recollecting a day, and it began to be painted in, and most of the work on it was done, the vast majority of work on it was done before Dyce knew anything about the origin of species. When we think about these questions, I think we need to keep in mind the sort of issues that Chambers continually raised in Vestiges and the kind of issues that are present here. And I'm just going to end with a quote from one of Robert Chambers' books. This was, in fact, was the explanations to the Vestiges. It was a sequel to the Vestiges, which explained some of what the book had been trying to do. And again, this was an anonymous quotation. When the awakened and craving mind asks what science can do for us in explaining the great ends of the author of nature and our relations to him, to good and to evil, to life and to eternity, the man of science too often turns to his collection of shells or butterflies, to his electric machine or his retort, and is as mute as a child who, sporting on the beach, is asked what lands lie beyond the great ocean which stretches before him. The natural sense of men who do not happen to have taken a taste for Caloptera or the laws of fluids revolts at the sterility of such pursuits and can hardly help condemning the whole to ridicule, however unjustly. No, it must be before another tribunal that this new philosophy is to be truly and righteously judged. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, James. I'm sure that simulated plenty of questions. We've got a bit of time now for questions and discussion. We would like to, yes, please.
I like the way that you put Darwin in the context of the framework of thinking and thinking that had gone on about evolutionary ideas. But it seems to me that he did two things in particular, and it's the combination of the two things. One was to accumulate a huge amount of evidence that evolution had actually happened. The second was to formulate a mechanism for it, and it seems to me that the combination of those two things gave him a particularly unique role, not a particularly unique, can't be particularly unique, a unique role in the development of evolutionary theory. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think it's very important to stress Darwin's impact on this debate is very substantial. There's no question about it. And the reason that people like Huxley think that Darwin has a lot going for it is completely different from Vestiges, is precisely because he meets the standards of what a scientific work would look like on these kinds of questions in a way that a book like Vestiges never really could. I think, I suppose what I would say is partly it's easy to underestimate the degree of accumulated evidence for evolution before Darwin publishes that's even in Vestiges. If you look at the general arguments that Darwin uses in the second half of The Origin, they're not as clearly stated in Vestiges, but they're drawing on general results of science which effectively were available to all educated Victorians. I mean, they really have to do with these ideas of developmental progress, embryological progress in particular, with geological progress. Darwin depends in a certain way on that kind of evidence. So in his argument, positive argument from geology, he says, we see lower forms earlier in the geological column, we see higher ones towards the end. So that kind of building block evidence at a kind of gross level was very much in play, and Vestiges in some sense brought that out for general discussion. Darwin does it much more rigorously, that's very clear. I think the mechanism issue is particularly important. I think it's not just that there's a mechanism, because there were lots of mechanisms before Darwin, and most people like Huxley don't accept Darwin's mechanism. The embryological mechanism that's in Vestiges, this developmental model, remains important after Darwin, and in fact really dominates evolutionary discussion right up to the origins of the modern synthesis in the 1930s. What Darwin does, I think, is he narrows the focus of what the really crucial scientific question is. He says, you know, we don't, as scientists, we're not going to focus on all different aspects of this. We're going to focus on a researchable question. And in his case, he says, you know, natural selection, this is a way we can think about this question. We can do serious science around the basis of this. And if you look at the next book Darwin publishes after The Origin, it's, you know, not a kind of general explanation of what he's doing in the way that the Vestiges author did. Darwin publishes his book on orchids, which is a book really to show people, you know, you can do research with this. This is a book for scientists. So he's trying to move the debate effectively from philosophy and theology much more into domain for people like Huxley and fellow scientists, who are, of course, increasingly important in terms of determining the consensus about science in this period. So I agree with you, but in a kind of slightly different way, if you see what I mean.
Thank you. Yes, Prof.
You mentioned Alfred Wallace. Could you say a little more about him in the context of what you've been describing? And to what extent was he exposed to Vestiges and the other literature?
Well, Wallace is a fantastic case for this, in fact, because the reason Wallace became a naturalist hunting for the cause and for an evolutionary theory was because he read Vestiges. He actually was a young man in the 1840s. He went to the Socialist Halls of Science in London and heard lectures. He read Vestiges, and as a result, he thought, you know, it was really important to figure out what, he wasn't satisfied with the Vestiges explanation, but he wanted to find out what the causes of new species were. So he leaves on his trips around the world, goes to the Indian Ocean, and then after that point, of course, you know, he does intervene in the debate in the ways that we know about that lead up to the publication of The Origin of Species. The other thing I think it's I'm very grateful to Wallace, not so much for discovering natural selection, but for encouraging Darwin not to publish the big 3-volume massive tome he was working on in 1858, 57, but instead to write a much shorter, punchier, exciting book, which is The Origin of Species. And I think Darwin basically got his fire back as a result of all the stuff around Wallace. And I think Wallace's origins is a much more commercial man, and somebody who was much more, actually a better writer in certain ways, really fired Darwin up to do the best he could by his theory.
Can I just ask, on the Vestiges, I think it was 1844, is that right? Yes. Wasn't that the year that Darwin published his 230-page kind of abstract? But he didn't publish it. He wrote down, you know, his initial thoughts and kept it private. Was that, if I got the year right, so was there a link between, was it that in response, or was that coincidental, or was that just a coincidence? Do you think?
Well, Darwin had finished that draft earlier in the year. So Darwin had reached the point where he felt like he could bring his ideas together. It's actually quite I mean, it could have been published in that form. I mean, it was published, in fact, in 1909. And it reads pretty well. I mean, it's not bad. It doesn't have all the full things, and it's missing certain aspects, particularly the principle of divergence. But it is actually, it provided the basis for the paper that Darwin gave at the Linnean Society. But what happens, I think, about it is that Darwin, rather than immediately going on to the next stage of writing out a fuller draft and writing it up at that stage, decides that the time isn't ripe, that his book, to write a short book like that in, say, 1846, 47, is going to make him look too speculative. Whether Darwin would have done that, and the whole debate would have been transformed in some other sort of way, I think it's hard to say. It's quite possible it would have taken him a lot longer anyway. I think Darwin isn't entirely convinced that he's got enough evidence at that point, and the fact that he writes a letter to his wife Emma saying, you know, what to do in the event of this, you know, in the event of my death, indicates that he's trying. He wants to make sure that he's got his ideas down, but he wants more evidence. And Vestiges really pushes him toward that direction.
Thank you. This question here, yes.
Would I be able to find a copy of book in 1845 in a public library?
Well, there were, insofar as there were public libraries, there aren't many of them in that period. There are a lot of subscription libraries and circulation libraries, circulating libraries, where if you pay a certain fee, then you can join and go in. So, or like if you belong to a local mechanics institute, a lot of them, or most of them, in fact, have copies of this book. Vestiges was very widely present within the most famous circulating library of the period, Moody's circulating library, as indeed was the Origin of Species, which I can't remember, it's like a third of the run of the Origin of Species was actually in the circulating library. Public libraries really only become important from the 1850s and after with the Libraries Act, but you could get it in these other sorts of libraries.
Yes.
In the Origin, Darwin spends a lot of time discussing possible objections to his theory and then producing arguments in favour and so on. Is that a new feature of scientific writing at that time?
I don't think it's unique by any means. I mean, certainly Charles Lyell, for example, went through and considered objections to his uniformitarian views in geology, because most people believed that there was a progressive history, and Lyell was trying to argue against that. So I think the thoroughness with which Darwin does it is quite unusual, and really going through one by one with the objections in the original work is quite unusual. In the Vestiges case, there was the original book, The Vestiges, and then that last quote I had, which basically says scientists are too focused on details. That quotation comes from a work called Explanations, which effectively is an answer to the critics, but after the fact. And that's the way a lot of Victorian polemics work, is that you have backs and forth. You also have later editions where you can add things. And Darwin, of course, added many answers to objections in the later editions of the Origin.
Yes, please.
Could you show us the slide that shows the number of copies? Yeah. Did you observe that there is a sharp rise around the mid-1880s?
Yes.
Could you explain?
Yes, I mean, the rise of that is quite interesting, and I think it's not just this book, it's many books, but in this particular case what's happened is the early editions of Vestiges have gone out of copyright, and so now other publishers can reproduce them. So this is an edition by Routledge, which was one of the main non-copyright producers. What happens during this middle period is actually quite interesting, and that is that this is the period when there are a huge number of effectively Vestiges-like books arguing for a kind of general developmental, gestational sort of cosmology, but they aren't Vestiges itself. So I think there's a kind of interesting history. The book tends to go down market at that point. The other thing that happens at that point, and because there are two different editions that appear, the other thing that happens is that Robert Chambers dies, his brother dies, and so the secret of the authorship is revealed at that point. It had remained a secret for almost 40 years. And although a lot of people had guessed, nobody was absolutely sure. And so even a few years before the secret's announced, people are still guessing wrong. So there was an edition that appeared with the author's name on it, and that created additional interest and attention to the book as well.
Yes, please.
I wondered how much your notion of your account of readership, to what extent it could take account of graphic art in this period and the role of wood engravings of animals and things like the Penny magazine on the one hand, and chromolithography, for example, of fossil fishes in Agassiz's work, and whether any account can be given of the role of graphic art in the period between Chambers and Darwin.
Yes, I mean, that's obviously a very complicated and fascinating question. I mean, I think one of the things that you'll see in relationship to the Darwin and the visual arts exhibition is that it really is primarily about evolution in the visual arts, and it's actually about all different forms of Darwinism, many of which are influenced very much by Vestiges, by Spencer and other sorts of people. And the story, in many respects, of the 19th century art has a very strong element of these kinds of issues present within it. There's a lot of interest in how you could see it in that picture I showed of the different brains. Which isn't exactly much as graphic, but it's very, there's something about that visually, even no matter how much the author of this book is going to say, these are not connected by any developmental process, you know, man, they really look connected. And I think that same, if you look at the works of Philip Henry Goss, Goss's works are explicitly anti-evolutionary, but there's a kind of way in which the vitality of the organisms that are depicted and the kind of way the color works to make you feel a sense of reality with them gives a sense that, you know, at some level nature has these vital powers within it that are going to lead to this developmental kind of growth and process. So there's a very, I think that this whole thing has a very strong visual dimension, which is well worth really looking into.
Last question, I think. Yes, please.
Pardon me, as Vestiges went through edition after edition, which I find heartening and curious, because you say that it wasn't or Chambers didn't feel it was well received. Did his scientific arguments become more vigorous to become more in line, I suppose, with what people were considering a proper scientific publication?
Yes, one of the things that's very striking is that many of the most objectionable aspects of the book disappear almost right away, actually, and reviewers start having to go back to the early editions and criticize those, because the later editions, as somebody says, its defects are much less disfiguring at this stage, and it became a lot harder to attack. There was actually a 70-page appendix at the back of some of the later editions, which outlines all the proofs from various authors with long quotations about what's being said. So there are aspects of it that remain, I don't know what you want to call it, but much more speculative than a lot of scientists would wish. But like, for example, the insects I mentioned remain in all the editions. But other parts, like the idea that nature is involved in circular classifications of each different organism relating to the others, which was quite an abstract method of classification and not very popular at the time that Chambers published. That goes out in the second edition and is out continuously after that point. So the book, it's one of the things about Victorian books that's wonderful about them. Not only do they discuss this developmental process, but typographically and in terms of what they actually do, because labor is cheap, they evolve themselves. And you have to really think about them as a kind of flow rather than as a static event that happens at one moment. And the origin, that's true as much as anything.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's a fascinating talk, I think. We all agree. And I think we want to thank Jim Secord very much again for a great lecture. Thank you.